Political leader of the MSJ, David Abdullah, is here with us. Mr. Abdullah, good morning. How are you?
Good morning. I'm very well, thanks. And good morning to all of your listeners and viewers, because you're on Talk City
yes,
as well.
91.1 FM,
yes,
correct.
And Independence greetings to all of Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you. Now let's start with the arrest of Mr. Ramlogan. You would have called for the appointment of a special prosecutor and a dedicated team of officers to investigate such allegations.
Yes.
So I'd like to get an idea of how this scenario would work.
Okay, the call really is not to deal specifically with the issue surrounding Mr. Ramlogan and the allegations of witness tampering. I'm not sure if he was actually arrested or just, held for questioning and so on. So it wasn't a special prosecutor to deal with his situation specifically. But this issue with Mr. Ramlogan, for example, is 2.5 years old. It was very early in 2015 that it surfaced, and he was asked to resign he was removed as Attorney General together with the then Minister of National Security, Gary Griffith. So 2.5 years to investigate what is really quite a simple matter. It's not trying to track, a huge range of financial transactions and so on. It really deals with a very specific issue. Is way too long. And so our position is that in general, when we are dealing with matters of corruption, and this is not the only one, there have been many allegations of corruption. The Prime Minister said last weekend that corruption is one of the biggest problems that the country faces and his government faces in general. I don't think he's speaking just specifically about what is happening now, but generally the culture of corruption in the society. And so we are saying, as the MSJ, that quite clearly the Integrity Commission has not worked. You have not seen anybody being forced out of public office or brought successfully to prosecution as a result of investigations by the Integrity Commission. Commissions of inquiry are hugely expensive, and they have not resulted in any persons being brought before the courts up to now. Lawyers make a ton of money out of them, representing one party or the other. And then the police service itself seems to have a great difficulty in terms of either its resources or its capabilities of dealing with white-collar crime. And so we are saying that the route to go is to have an office of special prosecutor, not an office, a special prosecutor appointed. Now, some people, I know when we said that originally several weeks ago, somebody put up on response on my Facebook page that I should be looking at the United States because that's the only place you have special prosecutors. I don't know the Constitution, and yet I'm aspiring to be Prime Minister. Some foolishness they put up like that. Not knowing, you see, people don't know the history of Trinidad and Tobago. And so they don't remember, or they don't know, or they choose to forget that the late Desmond Allen, Senior Counsel, was in fact appointed a special prosecutor during the period of the NER government, 86-91, to follow through on evidence and information that had been obtained in the Commission of Inquiry into Drugs and so on, which was known as the Scott Commission of Inquiry, after the sole commissioner, who was a former High Court judge. And Desmond Allen prosecuted Randolph Burrows, former Commissioner of Police. So he was special prosecutor. And then you had Carl Hudson Phillips, also Queen's Counsel, former Attorney General, who during the period of the UNC, when Mr. Ramesh Maharaj was Attorney General, was appointed a special prosecutor, and he was investigating matters related to the Piarco airport construction. And persons in the United States, as a result of that evidence, actually went to jail. Money was returned to Trinidad and Tobago. Persons in Trinidad and Tobago are still before the courts.
So it has worked?
It has worked, yes. And so we are saying that this is a way to go with a person who, or persons who are very capable in criminal law and so on, supported by what was called the Anti-Corruption Investigating Bureau of Police Officers. We don't know what has happened to that. It seems to have dissipated, but a dedicated team of police officers and, where necessary, forensic auditors, external forensic auditors, not an accounting firm, but forensic auditors who could follow the money where there are allegations of financial wrongdoing. So we weren't calling for this specifically with respect to Mr. Ramlogan's matter or allegations with respect to him. It was a general call to deal with white-collar crime and corruption generally.
Talking about white-collar crime, would you say our society is a little bit lenient when it comes to dealing with white-collar crime?
Well, lenient is a soft word. We just don't deal with it at all. There are some persons who seem to, for example, there was the wife of a senior police officer who was arrested recently and charged with 400 and odd counts of fraud. So there are instances of persons being charged with fraud, normally with respect to defrauding someone. In other words, and there was a businessman recently as well who was charged and so on, where you try to tender checks that are false checks, you know, that kind of defrauding, or people perhaps working in a bank and taking money out of somebody's account illegally and so on. Those kinds of matters are more straightforward, and those, when they come to light, are generally pursued, often not in the press and so on. But where it comes now to matters of, say, public procurement,
yes,
where somebody pays a bribe or there's a finder's fee that is improper and so on and inappropriate, those matters are not investigated, it seems, because we never read about them in the newspaper, we never hear about them. Matters related to money laundering. There was somebody, for example, who was charged and convicted in the United States courts, served time. In fact, he came back to Trinidad and Tobago, who was the owner of a big casino chain which operates here in Trinidad and Tobago as well. And he was convicted in the US for money laundering or, you know, related charges. So, but here in Trinidad and Tobago, that doesn't happen, and that is what we need to address fundamentally with this special prosecutor.
So I want to switch to the topic of the appointment of Mr. Hunte as the Public Utilities Minister and all of the issues surrounding that. First of all, what are your comments?
Well, it's, you know, it really is a kind of nonsense. I mean, I'm trying to find a word to dignify it, but it's ridiculous that in this day and age, someone who is going to be appointed minister, and this was put out in the media several weeks ago,
yes,
that Mr. Hunte was the likely person. I mean, I know the gentleman, I've known him for many, many years and so on. And the thing is that he ought to have then said and disclosed, you know, well, when I was in Ghana, because he was working with Republic Bank. In Trinidad and Tobago, he was in Barbados in a senior position. Then when Republic bought over a bank in Ghana, he went to Ghana to live and to work. Okay, all that is fine, professional career and so on. But he ought to have then said, you know, I obtained Ghanaian citizenship when I was living in Ghana and working in Ghana, and just simply informed. So he fell down on the job in that regard. Whether he knew the Constitution or not, he should have checked and said, is this an issue? And then secondly, you know, in terms of appointments, the Prime Minister's office should simply have a quick checklist. You know, are you about to be declared bankrupt? Are you suffering from mental illness? Those are things that under the Constitution disqualify you from holding public office. And one of them, of course, is having voluntarily become a citizen of another country. Then that also disqualifies you. So those are issues that there should be a quick checklist, statutorily and so on, as a matter of process. And that clearly wasn't done. And the more fundamental issue, though, quite apart from, you know, the total breakdown of people's responsibility, is the fact that in 2 years' time, we have had 5 ministers of public utilities. So we have had, first of all, former Brigadier Cecil Antwine, then you had Mr. Fitzgerald Hines, then you had Ms. Magnie MacDonald, then you had the Prime Minister, then Mr. Hunte, and back to the Prime Minister, and it may go back to Mr. Hunte. Now, you can't run a major government activity ministry. Of course, the ministry is not responsible for day-to-day functions as management of the board, but policy, and policy is critical when you're dealing with water, you're dealing with electricity, telecommunications, and there are perhaps some other areas that fall under the portfolio of the telecommunications minister. Obviously, like the Telecommunications Authority of Trinidad and Tobago is another huge one, which is a regulatory body that is responsible for giving out licenses for media, et cetera, et cetera. So that's another major one. And there are outstanding issues with respect to that, like the issue of cable and wireless and Flow Columbus buying out, you know, acquiring Flow, and they having a telephone, you know, license and being in conflict with their 49% ownership of TSCT, and they were supposed to dispose of those shares. That hasn't happened yet. And there are other things, the Neela Massey sale of its telephone services to TSTT and requirements that TAT has to oversee. So the Minister of Public Utilities, while he is not responsible for those things day to day, but he's responsible for the policy that guides those important functions of the country. And you can't have 5 ministers of public utilities in 2 years. That demonstrates a total lack of seriousness to the approach of managing the critical areas of water, electricity, telecommunications in this country. And so that itself suggests, a major gap in the government's, organization.
Well, that is what I wanted to ask you. Would you say there's a crisis in government?
I wouldn't go so far as to say there's a crisis in government. I would say, in terms of the government itself, with how the cabinet functions and so on, there's quite clearly, in my view, a crisis of governance generally in the country, because we have had, in the last 5 years of the UNC, we had many cabinet reshuffles. I mean, I went in as a senator. I left voluntarily, but the 31 senators, of which I was one, that was sworn in June 2010, I think only about 3 remained to the very end. So the vast majority, 28 persons, were out. And not only were those 28 out, but some came in and went out as well. So there probably about 40 people transited the Senate in 5 years. So that itself was an indication of tremendous instability during the UNC period. And UNC speaks today about the instability of this government. They forget the instability that they went through. And the country sometimes forgets that, and we ought not to let people forget what they were responsible for and accountable for. So we have a crisis of institutions in the country. We are on the eve of our 55th anniversary of independence. Our post-independence institutions, what I call the First Republic, which was established by the Republican Constitution of 1976, those institutions have collapsed. They're not working. The service commissions, there are a huge number of vacancies in the public service, in the teaching service, and so on. So the service commissions, look at how long we haven't been able to appoint a commissioner of police, and so on. So our institutions are not working. The justice system isn't working. The backlog in the criminal courts is horrendous, and so on. Look what happened with Base Air Caesar and all of that, imbroglio and so on. Our ferry service has collapsed. The sea bridge has collapsed. So our institutions are not working, and therefore we have a crisis not just of government, but a crisis of governance and of our institutions. And the problem is that governments that come in don't understand the real nature of the problem and or are not prepared to confront the nature of the problem. So it is business as usual. The status quo remains intact. And once that status quo remains intact, we're going to continue to be in crisis as a country.
Before we move to the topic of the retrenchment of CNMG workers and that kind of thing, I just wanted to ask you, would you support the move to have Mr. Hunte reinstated in the event that he were to relinquish his Ghanaian citizenship?
Well, I mean, he would start off in a bad position. So while his renouncing of his Ghanaian citizenship would make him eligible to go forward, he would start off in a position where his credibility and his legitimacy is tarnished and compromised. Mm-hmm. And therefore his ability to gain the respect and regard of all of the stakeholders would be significantly reduced. And so in a sense, it's an appointment that doesn't make sense, a reappointment that doesn't make sense because of the fact that his credibility and judgment would be in serious doubt and question.
Now we've seen the phasing out of GISL. GISL has officially closed their doors. Workers have been sent home. Now we're hearing about CNMG being closed. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, of course, the board of directors of both companies, which was set up just after 2015 September elections, chaired by Helen Drayton, came up with a major study. Yes. I mean, I came in the studio myself. There were panels, there were all these many panels publicly televised, and people were calling in, and there were contributions about the future of these two entities. And a major recommendation was made way back in early 2016, which recommendation was for GISL to cease functioning as a separate company, that the functions of government information should be brought under the Government Information Services Division, so it returns to the public service as a government mechanism or means of communication of its policies, programs, activities, and so on, and helping to coordinate the communication strategies of each ministry. And that seemed to make sense. so that persons who are in GISL could have functioned within the Government Information Service Division as expanded as the case may be. That CNMG ought to have become a public broadcasting company. That is a position that MSJ supports.
Right.
So the continuation of CNMG, whether you call it TTT or not, is not important. If you call it TTT, it's simply a successor company. So you don't need to retrench workers. We are opposed to the retrenchment of everybody, that you close it down, send home everybody, and then let people reapply for a job. That doesn't make sense, because the skill set within CNMG now is the same skill set that you're going to require in general terms going forward.
But the minister did make the point also that persons who were hired under CNMG, they were hired with a specific mandate in mind. However, the mandate for TTT would be different. So, hence.
Well, that's what I'm saying in general. So you may have, if you have, for example, and I'm not trying to suggest that this person is redundant, but if you have, for example, somebody who is involved in some kind of commercial type activity, then perhaps that focus would be somewhat different, because you're not now looking for normal advertising like a commercial television station. However, you will need to get sponsors for major programming that you want to do in terms of new film and so on. So there may be a shift of focus and so on. We think there should be a continuation of the newsroom, because it would be very bad to have two commercial entities, television stations, who control major radio stations, running all the news of Trinidad and Tobago.
Okay. It was a pleasure having you.
I wish I could speak a bit more about CNMG, because I really think it's very important that we have a full discussion around the future of public broadcasting in Trinidad and Tobago.
We have some time, hopefully, in the coming weeks.
Because I think the radio stations need to continue, but as a community radio station.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, it's always a pleasure having you on, always hearing your side of the story. Well, just to remind you, tune into CTV's Independence Day edition from tomorrow at 6 a.m. So that's our show for today. News is up next. Stay tuned.